Good morning. I'm David Eyes. I'm the Director of Automotive for DI Central, and I'm here to introduce the next speaker. Before I do, I would like to thank Ashley, Rick, and the rest of the TAMA team for a wonderful show. Looking around the room, I can see that you enjoyed last night's festivities as much as you did the conference. I have a confession to make. On the first day of the conference, I lost my glasses. So I am unable to read the profile of our next speaker, so I'm going to try and remember as much as I can. But I'd like to introduce Thiele. Terry has 40 years' experience in the industry, and he helps companies with their strategic planning and business issues with a focus on environmental. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce Terry to the stage. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Terry Thiele, and I spent 40 years doing strategic planning. Retired a year ago, and since then I teach, and I've done some consulting with Symphony Advisors. Symphony Advisors has got 130 professionals worldwide, putting their 2,000 years of practical experience to work customizing strategy, operational improvement, and organizational development for our clients, delivering real-world bottom-line results. Symphony, in turn, is a member of the BDO Alliance. BDO is a professional services firm that for more than 100 years has developed assurance, tax, and financial advisory services to clients throughout the country and around the globe through numerous industry-specific practices, utilizing world-class resources with an unparalleled commitment to meeting client needs. Now that I got that out of the way, welcome to the next industrial revolution. I have to tell you, the purpose of this speech is to be provocative. And if you don't agree with half of what I say, that's okay, because hopefully the other half will suffice. You should also realize that I've been doing this for 40 years, and I don't particularly care if you don't agree with me. What I'm going to talk about isn't anything new from me. A lot of the pieces to this puzzle are really in the hall. What I'm going to try to do is pull them all together and put them in context. So, here we go. Average lifespan, Fortune 500 company, has gone from 90 years to 18 years. No one is immune. And it's not just the big guys. All publicly traded companies, their lifespans are dropping. Begs the question, what kills companies? I would argue that there are three types of issues every business confronts. The 51% solution problem is Jethro painting lines in the parking lot. It's a $300 contract, and he's judgment-proof to begin with. So how much time are you going to spend on that issue? That's a 51% solution. On the other end are the 99%ers, and those are planet killers. If you don't get those right, you lose your business. And in between are the 85%ers, and that's where you spend most of your life. They've got to be more right than wrong, but you're not going to dot every I and cross every T. The good news is that historically there are very few 99%ers. You're mostly trying to keep your email inbox clear of the 51%ers. And of course, the risk potential cost with those 99%ers is huge, which means that it's important to avoid them to spend the time and the effort to miss out on the 99 percenters. Not worth it on the 51. So those 99 percenters, what actually kills companies? Well, I would argue that people don't pay attention to their business model, and they miss transformational themes. So what happens is you either boil the frog or you run into a bridge abutment. Give you an example from my hometown, Cleveland, Ohio. The Addressograph Moldograph Corporation. Does anyone in the audience know what the Addressograph Moldograph Corporation is? I'm not seeing a single hand. Well, before computers, AM made all the office machinery that kept businesses running. Everything that had to do with paper. They're probably, by the way, my dad worked there. Their most ubiquitous product, actually, were dog tags. Huge factory off of Babbitt Road in Cleveland, Ohio. And basically, they made, I remember running an addressograph machine in law school. Every time you sent out a mailing, you had to get all of these addresses, and each address would be typed onto a little metal plate. Then you'd have a long drawer with these metal plates in it, and you'd take the drawer and you'd put it in a machine, and that machine would then stamp the address on each envelope. That's how you did mailings before computers. But unfortunately, their best year was 1968. And then computers came along. That's where their global headquarters is today. All right, well, let's now talk about what kills industries. Obviously, the preceding speaker screwed up my question here, because these are the two pictures he was talking about. Can anybody notice anything interesting about these two pictures? Well, the answer is, in the one, there's a single automobile, and in the other, there's only one horse. That was 13 years. But he didn't take away, for me, the key question. What is the issue driver that drove that change, that dramatic change? What is the issue driver? Anybody have an idea? It was manure. In 1894, representatives from London, Paris, and New York got together to try to figure out what to do with manure, because the cities were drowning in it. No one saw the impact of automobiles to address that problem. So, what's changing? Why am I up here? Well, I would argue, here's my thesis, that the number of planet killers is changing to that. And I'm not the only one saying it. Begs the question, why? Why is that changing? Well, let me give you a little background first and give you some scene setting. This is probably not the best picture for this audience, but when you think about the history of humanity, 99.9% of it was driven by muscle power. Every building that was built by the Roman Empire was built with muscle power. And then along came the Watt-Boulton steam engine. Made a dramatic change. Now, we went from a world of customized production to mass production. Early industrial revolution, manufacturing was dramatically increased, but we still had problems with transportation and communication. So economic spheres were about as far as you could get round trip on a horse in a day. And if you think about the map of the United States, from the eastern seaboard up through the Appalachians, the towns and villages are spaced out about as far as a horse could get round trip in a day. Every town had a shoemaker. So you had relatively small economic spheres. As the Industrial Revolution matured, now the transportation got better, communication got better along with the mass production, and your economic sphere became about how far it took to refill the water tank on a steam locomotive. So once you get into the plain states, you'll notice that the towns are spread out more, and that's the reason why. Production now started to consolidate. On the flip side, the consumer now had a Model T, which enabled the consumer's breadth of consumption to expand as well. And when you see the cost of transport and communication, that went down dramatically. And so it's led to a world where we've gone from this to that, a single global economic sphere. Well, in this world, we're pretty good at understanding value chains, where competitors are strong and weak. We've done this for 100 years. We know how to gather competitive intelligence on our competition. And we understand business model maturity. This is the Slywatsky value curve, where your company sits on that curve. And there's been a whole lot of macroeconomic work done on this. This is your classic price-quantity relationship. Your Samuelson 101, okay? Comparative advantage, price elasticity, economies of scale. Everybody, this is chapter verse. Why is this changing? Well, this is my thesis. We are on the cusp of a meta-revolution that is going to fundamentally change everything. So it begs the question, how do you make money today? Well, you need data that you analyze to give you some intelligence. And then you take that intelligence and you analyze it to draw some insights. And then from those insights, you can then form a strategy. Okay. Well, what kind of intelligence do I need? I'd argue there are three types. Strategic intelligence is about the larger business environment. Market intelligence is about the industry in which you operate. And competitive intelligence is about the stakeholders within that industry. What does business look at today? Well, I would argue most businesses spend most of their time and treasure looking at competitive intelligence. Some of them will look at market intelligence, but it is surprising how few pay any attention to strategic intelligence. Their time frames are almost exclusively the next several quarters. Sometimes you look out maybe 5 years, but nobody's looking out 10 to 20 years. What's happening to change that? I would argue that there's a range of societal changes coming at us that we need to pay attention to. Demographics explains 2/3 of everything. That's a David Foote quote. I'm going to repeat that. Demographics explains 2/3 of everything. Poverty rate since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, dramatic reduction, and the forecast for the future is even better. That's good news. Food supply, getting better. Sanitation, getting better. Child labor, going down. Child deaths, going down. That's all good news. Urbanization, for the first time ever. More people live in cities than in the country. And where this is happening is in the developing world. And in fact, if you saw the journal yesterday, there's an article about millennials. We've already reached peak urban population in the United States. Millennials are leaving cities. Why? Because they're forming families, and it's funny, but once you have kids, you need a yard. Okay. But the issue with urbanization is it going to be organized, or is it going to be chaotic? Okay. Deflation. The UN keeps telling everyone that the world's population is going to continue to increase through the end of the century up to 12 or 13 billion. There are a number of demographics experts that are contesting this because they're failing to take account of the impact of urbanization on childbirths or on fertility rates. And in fact, in the country, having children is an economic benefit. They're farmhands. But in the city, they're an economic drain. And when women get into the city, they stop having babies. Hans Rosling said, economic growth was driving demographics. Now it's the other way around. What's interesting, one of my demographics guys, Richard Hokinson, Dick says this is going to be the Anglo-Saxon century because the only countries that are going to reproduce themselves, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, in part because our birth rates are better and in part because of immigration. These are the countries where people want to go. Now, we had a conversation yesterday about immigration. You need to look at these issues with a 10-year perspective. It takes all of the tweeting out so you see the trends. United States has always been a country of immigration. It will continue to be. But what's really interesting is if you look at those demographic patterns, you want to have a demographic pattern that's a nice pyramid. That's India and the United States in 2050. You don't want to have an inverted pyramid because that means you've got old people outnumbering young people. The average age in China is now higher than the average age in the United States. Nearly half of the countries of the world aren't at replacement level. If you want to see what the future looks like in the developed world, look at Japan. And China's demographic challenges are a time bomb. They got old before they got rich, and they don't have any kind of social net for that aging population. That's an interesting book to read. I got another one I just picked up, The Accidental Superpower by Peter Zeihan. But what that leads to is a deflationary world. In your business, sooner or later, you are going to have to take a bigger piece out of a smaller pie. We're already living in a world of negative yields where you're actually paying banks and governments to hold your money for you. Deflation. Deglobalization. Well, we've seen nationalism on the rise in Europe, the current Brexit controversy, and we've certainly seen the issue here in the United States. I think what it stands for is the proposition that in developed world democracies since the end of the Second World, the technocracy model that evolved is now being challenged and that we are at an inflection point. How this plays out remains to be seen. But it's no longer traditional liberals versus conservatives, it's now nationalists versus globalists. Interestingly enough, the Ukrainian president to whom our president was speaking was just elected with 73% of the vote, and he's a comedian. That tells you something about how developed country electorates are viewing their politicians. Consumer behavior. Well, certainly hours worked is going down, life expectancy is going up, growth of the American leisure hours is increasing. So we're going from a world of this to a world of this, which means that we're spending more on experiences and travel. Boomers are. I am. And millennials are spending more on purpose-driven consumption. Employee behavior. Well, we are looking at millennials. We talk all about millennials all the time. You really need to start talking about Gen Z. They're the ones in college at the moment. And they're not exactly the same thing as millennials. We now have women in the workforce at the blue-collar level like never before. And we now have more women at the academic level than ever before. The point is, all of this is happening at the same time. Now let's talk about technology. We are looking at a technological revolution unlike anything you have ever seen. Repeat that. We are looking at a technical revolution like anything you have ever seen. This is Joseph Schumpeter's Schaffreichs Zerstörung. Talk first about energy. Actually, energy consumption is going to plateau within our lifetime. McKinsey puts it, well, close to 2030 when we're almost there. Current trends suggest we're going towards an off-grid world, a cheap energy world. Renewable energy costs are going down. So arguably, we're looking at a future of cheap, ubiquitous, off-grid energy. 3D printing. Well, I don't have to tell this audience about 3D printing. But the one thing that I would emphasize about 3D printing is its impact on design. Because for the first time, rather than taking a block of something and removing pieces to design from the outside in, you now have the capacity to design from the inside out. So for me, the biggest impact on 3D printing while the technology evolves and rapid production increases is its impact on design. And I don't think we've really appreciated that yet. But of course, it can print everyday articles, it can print really big things, it can print really small things, it can print things that are incredibly sophisticated, things that are incredibly strong. You can do it on your kitchen table, that's Walmart. Or on your desktop. Or you can have one of these companies here do it for you. The point is 3D printing enables the creation of things that heretofore had been impossible. And in fact, the economists thought that was the third industrial revolution all by itself. Nanotechnology, it's not just, it's functional systems at the molecular level. It's not just nanoparticles, and I know, I'm sorry, it's a eye chart, but it gives you a sense as to the application of nanoparticles. It's also about the systems, structures, and as that growth takes off, we're right at that inflection point. Automation. Again, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know about automation. That's how we used to do it. That's how we're doing it now. This is how Amazon's doing it, and my video's not running. It's going to be a big challenge. So not only is this a technological change, it's a societal change. New materials. When I first started doing this presentation a number of years ago, I had one slide with like half a dozen new materials. It's gotten to the point where I have to have a slide that shows lists of new materials, because there are a lot of lists of new materials. Everybody's got their own. The point is, everywhere you look, new materials are emerging with different properties, different cost profiles that enable performance heretofore unexpected and unanticipated. New materials. The Internet of Things. Having a sensor on everything. And then all of the data that you get off of those sensors. And then the analysis of that data leads you to a whole world of applications. And if you can't figure it out yourself, you have artificial intelligence do it for you. Wall Street Journal estimates that it'll have an impact of $13 trillion on the economy by 2030. Digital manufacturing industry 4.0. In this application, note the difference between the extreme left and the extreme right. What's interesting is when businesses were surveyed, not only did they say it was important, they said this is going to be table stakes. Okay. Table stakes. Digital factory. Blockchain, a way of doing transactions that provides additional security, flexibility, and ease. There are a lot of companies that are engaged in this. Interestingly, J.P. Morgan in 2017 called it a fraud and threatened to fire anybody that worked on it. And here this past year, they've now come out with their own cryptocurrency. And then here's one that I really don't understand, synthetic biology. Okay, I'm not smart enough, but this is basically biology and engineering put together, and apparently it comes in colors. And it's another eye chart, but it gives you a sense of the different applications for this disruptive technology. Welcome to the next industrial revolution, because they are all happening at the same time. We are going, I would argue, from that global mass production world back to a local custom production world. And I'm not the only one saying this. When you think about the peak of mass production, it was in that 1955 era on when my dad worked at a dressograph moldograph. But we are going from a world of supply or demand exceeding supply to a world of supply exceeding demand. Think back to the demographics. Topic's not really new. Anderson came out back in 2004 talking about the long tail. That was primarily in the context of the internet and music and books, things like that, where you could translate it all into electrons. But it applies now to manufacturing. You think about that iron law between cost and product. When you mass customize, that goes away. So the traditional 80-20 rule, where I got 80% of my money off of 20% of my SKUs, goes away too. If you remember anything from this lecture, remember this quote from Chris Anderson. We are going from a focus on dozens of markets of millions to millions of markets of dozens. And I'm not the only one saying this. Introduce you to Local Motors. They were the first company to 3D print a car. They work a lot in autonomous electric people movers, and they use micro factories. There's a lot of maker activity out there. If you're interested in what a view of that world might look like, this is an interesting book. It's science fiction, The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson. Plot's kind of weird, but the world he creates is very interesting. It was written, interestingly enough, in 1999. So how do you make money in this world? Well, you still need that data and analysis, and you still need those insights, and you still need to build that strategy. And the intel you need it all. Think about this. We knew how to gather intel when we were in a world of dozens of millions. But when I'm in a world of millions of dozens, and that gets replaced with that, how do I understand what my competition is doing when I've got hundreds, thousands of competitors all customizing their product? We knew how to do value chains in dozens of millions. But what happens when I'm looking at millions of dozens and one of my competitors absolutely disrupts the marketplace by going off and doing something really weird? How do you figure it out? Well, you see, innovation up until now, I would argue, has been a nice to have. We've got a given business, let's grow it. We'll figure out how far out into that white space we want to go, how much risk we want to take on. I'm here to tell you that in the future, it's going to be the other way around. They're coming after you. Apologies, apparently my slides didn't translate well there. When you think of business model maturity at dozens of millions, again, you know where you are on that curve. What happens when the rate of change is so dramatic in a world of millions of dozens? How do I keep track of my business model maturity? Think of those microeconomic measurements of business success that we've always used. And when that goes away and gets replaced with millions of dozens, those are all gone. The barriers of entry aren't there. Economies of scale aren't there. All of the units of measure to perform, or to business performance, are now subject to change. Did anybody here read Samuelson 101 in Econ? Anybody? Or am I just that old? Well, Mr. Samuelson's Econ 101 is obsolete. Okay, so back to this slide about what killed the horse and buggy industry begs the question, what's going to kill the automobile industry? Well, there's a lot going on out there that's going to change it. Micromobility. Those damn scooters out on the sidewalk. Get run over by one of those things. McKinsey calls this the next great inflection point, curiously enough. Can anybody identify the article on the left? Well, I'll cut it short. That's a buggy whip holder. Begs the question, how long will it be before you can't identify the item on the right? Pretty scary. Okay. So how do we look at that future? How do we figure out what's going on? Well, there's a problem with forecasting. Think of any group that was better or has more money to forecast something than the oil industry, okay? Well, you go back 10 years and everybody talked about peak oil. Nobody was talking about shale gas. You go back 5 years, everybody was talking about shale gas. Nobody was talking about $55 a barrel. You go back, everybody was talking about $50 a barrel. Nobody was talking about $27 a barrel. Eye chart, but this is from January. Prices are likely to remain weaker than what many major oil producers anticipated just 3 months ago. They can't even figure it out 3 months, let alone forecast the future. Well, we've all seen hockey sticks. This is a legitimate business set of forecasts that McKinsey published for a company. And international organizations can't do it any better. This is the IMF forecasting global economic growth. So let me introduce you to scenario planning. Scenario planning looks at potential futures, not probable futures. So it attempts to identify those futures that have the greatest potential impact and enables you to play the what-if game. Methodology. Well, you look at the four corners of, or I should say the deliverables, You look at the four corners of possible developments and you get to think about things that managers don't ever get to think about. It doesn't guarantee the future and it doesn't build your strategy. Methodology. You identify transformational themes. Think of that issue driver, manure. Nobody picked that one up. You take the two most important themes, you take their extremes and combine them into a plus, 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 minus, 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 plus. You get four scenarios. Litmus test has to be plausible. Having spaceships landing, that's not a good scenario. But it's still got to be provocative. It still has to make you think. Then you're in a much better position to build your business strategy. And if you've done it right, the future lurks within the four corners of the scenarios you've built. So let's take a look at societal change, technological change, and ask how you might play these out in scenarios. Well, those were all of the societal changes we mentioned that are going to impact the world economically. So arguably the two extremes are a nice middle-class bell curve world or a rich-poor dumbbell world. And then how does that play out in terms of business impacts, both macroeconomic on markets and microeconomic on businesses? I would argue as a starting point that the world might fit into one of these four boxes over the next 15 years. Think of a microeconomic business structure of many small businesses versus few big, and a market structure of many a global market versus many local. Now, we're not at this point saying which is going to happen. What we're doing is looking at four alternative futures and asking, how does my business perform in this scenario? What's the gap between where I am today and where I need to be in order to be successful in that particular world? And if you assume that that's where we are today, you're then in a better position to then forecast and build a strategy based upon where you stick the pin in the map. Okay? Let's look at the technological change implications. That was the list we went through. Well, this is how it plays out. Are you looking at mass or micro manufacturing? Are you looking at labor-intensive versus automated? What are your performance attributes? Is it bricks and mortar or online? Whole range of variables. The problem with this side is you're not talking about, if you will, generic markets. You're down to your industry. Well, different industries, these technologies are going to play out differently. So how it plays out in transportation is going to be very different than if I'm in perishables. Okay. The one problem with scenario planning is you take those two transformational themes, and depending upon what you've selected, there tends to be perceived in your planning team one end which is really nice and one end which is really bad. And so what tends to happen is you get one scenario that everybody loves. And then you get another scenario that's the end of the world. And a couple that are in between and you can't make up your mind. So whenever I do scenario planning, I insist, and oh, by the way, businesses then, when they forecast, tend to pick the unicorn. Because that's our future. That's what they want it to be. So you always want to force the business to think about the worst case scenario. Okay, now let's talk about the transport sector. Transformational themes, urbanization, that nice suburban middle class, versus a dense, urban, rich, poor environment, and technology depending upon how aggressive the commercialization of all of those technologies occurs. I would argue you've got 4 futures for the transport sector: Dismalville, Sprawlton, Schizoid Land, and Transsectaria. We'll take a moment and look at each of those. Dismalville, this is a future where you've got rich, poor, chaotic megacities. Trade is balkanized. It's not a global market. There's not a whole lot of urban planning going on here. And technology has disappointed. What you would do in this sort of world is you'd ask the question, how am I going to manufacture goods? Because that then dictates what moving goods looks like. And then what do moving people look like? And you take your baseline as to where you think they are today, and you extrapolate them out into what that scenario plays out. Now, the nice thing about scenario planning is you're making up the numbers. Okay, this is not a forecast. So these pie charts at the bottom might be provocative, but they're forcing you to think. Sprawlton. This is a middle-class suburbia world where you do have global trade, but not a whole lot of planning, some, but not a whole lot. And again, technology is disappoints. I'd argue that maybe this looks the closest to our current state of affairs. So maybe 15 years from now, it's the present on steroids, maybe. And again, the same process. You ask where you are today, and then you assume where you're going to be in the future. These 3 blocks would obviously look different than Dismalville. The top would be the same. But what you're doing with these is you're developing a gap analysis. I tend to do OTSWAs, not SWATs. Okay, opportunity, threat first. Outside the gate, what's the opportunity or threat posed by where I think that future is going to go? Then I come inside the gate, and I ask, how strong or weak am I today to deal with that opportunity or threat? So I've now got a gap analysis based upon those issue drivers that I can now create operational objectives to, okay, these are the things I've got to do to fill that gap. And once I've got my operational objectives, then I can build a tactical plan to work in real time to get to where I need to be. Schizoid land. This is an interesting one. Rich, poor megacity, balkanized trade again. Now we've got some planning, as you can see on the one side of the fence. And there's new technology on that side of the fence, but it's not affordable for all. Same process. The top boxes look the same, but these are going to be very different from Sprawlton and Dismalville. And finally, Transsectaria. This is probably the unicorn, at least for some, maybe not for people that make internal combustion engine vehicles. Middle-class suburbia, global trade world, extensive planning, and new technology readily available. Think autonomous vehicles that are electrified, internal combustion engine, passenger cars, not so much. When we've done these, basically the 3 out of these 4 passenger cars go away. The one thing that stays is heavy duty because of energy density. Now, you could still crack the code on battery weight, but up until now, energy density keeps internal combustion engines in heavy duty. Same process. Now that you've gone through the 4 scenarios, if that's where we are today, this is a 1-tiered, not a 2-tiered set of scenarios. The first thing you ask is, where do I think that urbanization point's going to be? And then where do I think technology's going to go? And then you take those 2 determinations and you put a pin in a map. Now you've got a forecast. And that's how it works. So, menu of things to consider doing for your company, because this is one set of scenarios. It's not the only set of scenarios. What are the 2 most important challenges that your business in the transport sector is going to confront over the next 10 years? What might those scenarios look like? Do that sort of gap analysis in terms of, are you well configured to deal with that future? And it's all not bad news. The buggy whip example I mentioned, the point the journal or the Times is making is that the people who made the most successful transition were the parts makers. It was the tier 2s and the tier 3s. Timken started out making bearings for wagons. So the future isn't necessarily bleak. It depends upon what you make of it. Welcome to your future. Questions? Anybody awake? Thank you very much.